It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Live from the green space today. And I'll say first off that when we're live in the green space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen to it because we stream live video on our website. You can just go to WNYC.org. Might be on the homepage, or you might have to go to WNYC.org/thegreenspace. Either way, if you want to watch the show, for those of you watching already, I'm waving. Hi. And anybody else can watch the Brian Lehrer Show today as well as listen. We have a great lineup of guests. Katie Couric will be here on the really challenging series on difficult questions that she's doing on television with National Geographic. Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, will be here. He wrote a book called How Bernie Won. I know he lost. But we'll talk about 2016 and 2018 and 2020. And we continue our series, The Eights, A Brief History of the Culture Wars, Decade by Decade. Today we continue on in 1968 with historian Peniel Joseph and others on the rise of the Black Power movement and how white backlash helped elect Richard Nixon president. We'll also include the 1968 Columbia University protests in black and white as part of that conversation. But we begin today with one of the most important journalists and journalism executives in the country today, Ben Smith, editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed. Now, far from its early reputation as the place for articles like 23 cat pictures you won't be able to resist, BuzzFeed News has also become a force for original and investigative reporting, news analysis, publishing the Steele dossier before anyone else thought that was an okay thing to do, and more. Ben Smith, who has New York roots, coming up at the Daily News and elsewhere in journalism, has been writing articles himself on the site too. Not every editor-in-chief does that, but good ones, including why corruption rather than collusion might be more likely to be Donald Trump's undoing, why Facebook is like a mid-20th century European colonial power, why it's...
That wasn't the headline.
I'll have to ask you about that one. What?
I said that was not the headline.
No, but that was your theme. Why it's Christmas for neocons now in the Trump administration. That was the headline. And a really great and humble read on mistakes that Ben made as a young reporter in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union and what they taught him about America and the world today. So hi, Ben Smith. Welcome back to WNYC and welcome to the Green Space.
Yeah, thank you for having me on with all your super fans here.
So I actually want to start with your reminiscence about reporting from Belarus in 2001 because it actually does so much to reveal truths, I think, about the Trumpian and Putinian world of today. You write that as a child of the 1990s, you had assumptions about the arc of history that made you a bad reporter. Very candid. Can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, you know, it was in back then the European Union and NATO were expanding inexorably eastward through Europe. There was a narrative, which by then, if you look closely, was nonsense in retrospect, that Russia was on this kind of rocky but inevitable path toward free markets and democracy. And Belarus was this funny little island of almost sort of comic Soviet-style governance that hadn't really had held on to this centralized economy and authoritarian state, really as in part because the people there saw Ukraine and Russia kind of deteriorating into anarchy around them and clung to this authoritarian dictator who was this, and still today is, this giant former collective farm boss called Alexander Lukashenko, who, again, feels like a caricature of an Eastern European autocrat.
So that what you just referred to, it was a very telling line for me in the article that liberals imagine Belarus as the next Poland, a post-communist success story. But people in Belarus were looking more to Ukraine as kind of a cautionary tale. And Ukraine, of course, cycles back around to be a Paul Manafort connection. Did Trump change the platform because of Russian collusion, or they have something on him, that kind of influence. So here we are with Ukraine as kind of playing the central role in how we think about Donald Trump. explain the context of looking to Ukraine rather than looking to Poland to understand what the world was going to become.
Right. Well, the post-Soviet countries, other than the Baltics, were basically in varying degrees taken over by former communist leaders who were privatized state assets into their own hands. The safety net fell apart without a real dynamic market economy emerging, and without a sense that all boats were being lifted.
So does that relate to the tolerance or appetite even that people have for authoritarian leaders today, including Putin, including whose name I forgot already, that still head of Belarus? How many terms is he in?
I think he's in his 6th term. He recently remarked there was some criticism of him because he's just incredible. He's very traditionalist, let's say, on the issues of marriage, that well, at least it is better to be a dictator than to be gay. That's his recent, when he was accused of being a dictator.
As you can tell, I haven't followed Belarusian presidential politics
but
very much.
I think that's certainly part of, I think in that particular place, I think for each of them, Putin has a very different appeal, I think, in Russia. In Belarus, it's very much about stability. It's about look to the east, look to the south. There's now a shooting war in Ukraine. Nobody says, wow, I wish our country were like Ukraine right now.
And even Trump, right, with part of his base not really caring that he acts like an autocrat in various ways?
I don't know. I think it's hard to draw these analogies, honestly.
Your mildly sneering article back then about what you thought was just a bad communist tractor factory. This was an article you wrote in the Wall Street Journal. You called it a tractor in every pot. What did you think you were seeing, and what did you learn years later that it really was? Yeah,
so this was, when you work for the Wall Street Journal, and I was a stringer. I was the least important sort of semi-employee of the entire Dow Jones empire. But your goal is to write stories that people who, are on Wall Street read and are amused by, and kind of sometimes display the follies of people who are resisting this inevitable march of capitalism in kind of a good-hearted, gentle way. And so I sort of found one of these stories in this tractor factory in Minsk. I think it's the tractor factory in the name of Lenin. I think it's still called that. And that was producing so many tractors that they were plowing the streets with tractors, and there were tractors sitting unused on collective farms because they couldn't afford the diesel to power the tractors, and were in fact using horses to plow the fields. And then when I went to the factory to interview them, they were incredibly paranoid and sort of defensive about not telling me. And usually you're a Wall Street Journal reporter, you walk into a business, they're very eager to tell you what's going on. Here they were sort of very secretive about it, and I portrayed them as these kind of Soviet goons who didn't know what they were doing, running this incompetent centralized economy. A few years later, around the Iraq War, a guy named Charles Dolfer wrote this quite detailed report into the arms trade to Iraq and elsewhere, and became clear that Belarus in general, this factory in particular, were major global sources for missile launchers to rogue regimes, and I had totally missed the story, totally misunderstood why they were being secretive.
It's a fascinating lesson. It really is. And last thing about this, you reported a scoop back then on American cash helping to influence the direction of Eastern Europe at that time. And what that made me think of in terms of today, and tell me if you think this one was a leap, like you thought for some reason that Trump's base being tolerant of his authoritarianism was a leap to compare it to in Eastern Europe. But what was that? And does it make you look at the issue of Russian meddling in our elections any differently today, to know that we were meddling with cash money flowing into other people's elections at that time?
Let's see. I was talking to this young activist, and there was this kind of slick, new grassroots activist group with great stickers and branding that was had based itself on the Serbian resistance. And he just mentioned to me offhand he'd go into Poland every month and pick up a suitcase full of cash from the Americans, and that's how they were funding the movement. And I put it into print because it was a good scoop, and got yelled at by the embassy and told that that this poor kid had been imprisoned and beaten because of my reporting, and which is something I carried for a long time and thought about for a long time. I don't know.
And it turned out you were lied to by the American official. The kid was not imprisoned and beaten, right?
Yeah, I finally looked him up, and he's working in a hotel in Prague, and he said, no, they never put me in jail.
And there you've carried that guilt for, almost 2 decades, and then you learned that it was the American official who was lying to you, and it wasn't the communist officials who really did the bad thing to the guy.
They later beat him up and he left the country. I mean, there's not a lot of, nobody looks great here.
But you didn't.
I mean, right.
But here we are,
certainly
meddling
there's
all over the country, all over the world.
All over the world and always have. I mean, I think, there are two ways to see it. Like, we were, in fact, meddling to support the democratic aspirations of people who were living under an authoritarian regime. I mean, I think that's, I don't think the analogy is exact. On the other hand, you see why people around the world roll their eyes when we complain.
My guest is the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, Ben Smith, here in the green space on the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. We can take phone calls for Ben Smith on anything you've read on BuzzFeed, or we'll get into some news of today as well. So we can be pretty broad here. Listeners, if you want to call in, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692, or just raise your hand here in the green space. So you published the Steele dossier at BuzzFeed when other news organizations, or maybe it was just CNN that also had it originally, remind me, would only describe it because of its salacious but unverified content about Trump and prostitutes in Russia and other unverified content. Can you take us back to the decision and tell us if it was a close call?
Yeah, let's see. There were a number of news organizations, including us, that had it for a period of months or of weeks, and we all saw it as a really interesting lead, and were chasing and trying to confirm or knock down various aspects of it. Had reporters, outside the Ritz-Carlton or in various other places. What changed the day we published it, right, is that CNN reported that this dossier existed, that it contained, in broad terms, potentially compromising information about the president and allegations of collusion, but we're not going to show it to you. We think it might scald your eyes out if you actually see this thing. So we're just going to sort of leave the innuendo hanging there, which I think it seemed to me, and just in this, that in a totally different media age where you have strong gatekeepers who totally control the flow of information, maybe there's an argument for acting like that. I think today, where people expect to trust but verify their media sources, we felt that it was that it was the right thing to do, to share the underlying document with our audience.
Let people see
and
it.
This was, and particularly what CNN reported was that this document had been briefed to two presidents of the United States, that this document was being fought over at the highest levels of the U.S. government. And I think, at the time, incredibly controversial decision. Everybody yelled at us for a couple of days. The president called us a failing pile of garbage. A year later, I'm not actually sure anybody thinks it was the wrong move. And I think it'd be hard if you look back at this year, like the fights between Devin Nunes and Adam Schiff over things that would be totally impossible to understand what the hell was going on if you didn't have the dossier.
Right. And I supported you on the air at the time, and I felt like, who are we as journalists to decide that the public can't see this thing if we have it and we're describing it? Anyway, what did Trump call you?
A failing pile of garbage.
So was that like...
I would say that's inaccurate.
But was it good for business, bad for business, or neither?
I think the jury is still out on that. I mean, I think our audience obviously appreciated the fact that we were being straightforward, that we're being straightforward with people. I think that is very much who we are as a news organization, that we are, our impulse is to, and partly I think because, we're called BuzzFeed, we don't have a 100-year-old brand. We can't just expect you to trust us based because you recognize our masthead. We expect you to trust us because we can prove that what we're saying is true, because we're sharing the documents, because we're being as open in our reporting as we can. So that is certainly part of how we think about the world, and maybe part of how we have to. I think the question of how Trump has affected media businesses, I mean, I think he likes to say that he's the best thing that ever happened to media. I think, he's this incredibly polarizing figure, and everything in every media property in some sense exists in relation to him. And I think that in its way is sort of a trap. And we certainly don't see ourselves as opposition media or as existing in relation to Donald Trump. How
do you see BuzzFeed overall in the media ecosystem?
I think we see ourselves as, an aggressive news reporting operation that's really independent and has real journalistic chops, and that I don't think we we aren't a sort of a generational, we aren't, when people talk about news for younger people or for millennials, that sometimes means, short words and big pictures and, like this kind of, this eternal stereotype that young people have short attention spans. I think for us, it means that we're focused on new stories, like, whether it's the rise of the alt-right or the Me Too movement, important news stories, but probably that a lot of our reporting resources are put into the Facebook story rather than the railroad pension story, for instance.
Yeah. You wrote an article about how corruption rather than Russia or racism is more likely to be Trump's undoing, if anything is. Why do you have that theory?
Yeah, I don't know. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm not sure I still believe that, but I do think I do think that for people who are most the sort of resistance people who are most committed to, who are most disturbed by the Trump administration, and for people who think about political science and the big picture, corruption is really the least of it. There's this idea that he's got some strange connection to the Russians, that he's eroding the fabric of civil society and of American life, and by sort of really being incredibly divisive. I think when you look at what actually brings down leaders, I think if you look at Yahoo in Israel right now, for instance, it is often the cash in the bag. It is often I think if you look at, actually in this state, if you look at Albany right now, it's not misgovernance that brings people down. Often it is very, very often very simple to understand. Often not that, it doesn't have to be that much money transaction in which a public servant is enriching themselves. And I think you see that happening all over the place right now.
Let's take a phone call. Here on line 5 is Vincent in Mill Neck. You're on WNYC, Vincent, with Ben Smith from BuzzFeed. Hi.
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Ben. I have a simple question. I guess, do you feel that the mainstream news outlets need to have a consequence to not sourcing or proper vetting of their stories? If you look at the example of Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, our president made a joke on Saturday Night Live about not finding them, yet hundreds of thousands of people died. We live in a society, Brian, that they can't even tell or see the geoengineering programs that exist over their heads. How are they going to believe something that's in another continent?
I'm not sure what that geoengineering I'm going to skip the geoengineering part of that question, if you don't mind. But I think, right? I think did the Times? The Times obviously had this incredible reckoning with itself over its handling of the Iraq War. I think one virtue of the Trump administration is that news organizations that used to be pretty captive to official administration sources and Washington sources have a healthily adversarial relationship with the White House. I think probably they/we should have had that, and at our best did have that kind of relationship with the Obama White House or the Clinton White House or the Bush White House. I do think there's this kind of, particularly this kind of foreign reporting where what you're really reporting on is arguments among White House officials and State Department officials that are 2 or 3 degrees removed from reality, and that's always a real trap.
Thursday is the 1-year anniversary of the Mueller investigation. We seem to be headed for Trump using that anniversary for something. Have a sense of what that will be? Like, is a constitutional crisis now 2 days away or something less than that?
I think that, the reporting suggests that Donald Trump wakes up every morning and decides what he's going to do that day. So I'm not sure that I can speak. I think it's very hard to predict.
You wrote an article called Trump Brings Christmas for Neocons, with the appointments of John Bolton as National Security Advisor and Pompeo as Secretary of State. What does Christmas for Neocons mean?
Christmas for Neocons was what one of my old neocon sources called it. I think just when you look at the cast of this administration's foreign policy, it's really the first Bush administration. It's not even it's the sort of Rumsfeld, Cheney. Probably Dick Cheney is the guiding spirit of the current foreign policy. To the extent the guiding spirit is not reality show sort of attention-getting reaction, because there's a lot of that too, but a kind of nationalism without a lot of interest in democracy, it was sort of a strand, and maybe neocon isn't quite the right word for that strand of the Cheney wing.
So the aggressive Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld cowboy attitude, if you want, as critics used to call it, that ended their term with really pathetic approval ratings by Democrats and Republicans alike is back. Didn't Trump run against exactly that?
Yes, he ran against exactly that by name, and claimed to have opposed the Iraq War, even though he didn't.
Right. He just wants to look tough because that's his brand, or looking like the un-Obama, like undoing the Iran deal and bringing in Bolton, in particular, is more important to his media strategy than looking like the un-Bush?
One lens of this is just right, that he's doing the opposite of whatever Obama is doing. And I think, and you look at North Korea, there's an opening that he has found where Obama was not able to. Iran is the opposite. That's certainly one way to look at it. I think there's also a sort of chest-thumping nationalism that is as much a style as an ideology that is pretty central to both early Bush years and the current administration.
And now Trump has tweeted that he's going to let off the hook a gigantic Chinese telecom company, ZTE, that violated, in particular, our sanctions on Iran, and that Trump's own Commerce Department and Obama's before it had punished for doing so. Do you understand what's going on there? Because I have no idea.
I mean, I've read a lot about it. I mean, and it is a wild situation, and I think there are two plausible explanations. One is something happened there that we have no idea what's going on. There's some transaction happening in the background that explains this otherwise inexplicable situation. The other is that Trump is trying to do a deal with the Chinese and do kind of a grand bargain that covers every single aspect of conflict, and this is one of them. And he is ignoring Justice Department policy and guidelines to try to make that deal. It does seem like he's offering. I mean, he's sort of offering an element of that deal in advance of getting anything in return, which just seems strange. But it's a little. But I think in these kind of, it's hard. I think it's, as often is true in this administration, pretty hard to figure out what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, there could be a benign explanation along the lines of what you're saying, some kind of deal that either has to do with trade or maybe has to do with North Korea, where, I mean, we want our president to be a negotiator, right? He ran as the ultimate deal maker, but he really seems like he's the ultimate just scream at your enemies and build that narrative of, I'm whooping the bad guys or being tough on the bad guys with my words. We actually want him to make deals that might involve giving something as well as taking something.
After I was in a small group of reporters talking to the French president after he met with Trump 2 weeks ago, and his point of view was he's trying to create crises in order to create sort of the conditions for a deal, and that it's a very risky way to get a deal, but potentially a good one.
We have a question here in the green space. Hi.
Hi. With regards to this, I had read either this in the New York Times or CNN that one of the aspects of this ZTE deal is that China is going to invest something like $500 million in some Trump enterprise.
There's a hotel. There's some kind of luxury hotel complex in Indonesia with Trump's name on it that a couple of days ago received a grant from a state-backed Chinese bank. Yes. I mean, I don't know.
Okay. Let's go. Let's see. We're going to go to line 6, which is David in Brooklyn. And I think this is David Yaski.
Wait, really?
From
Councilman,
or former councilman. Hi, David.
Hey, Brian, and hello, Mr. Smith.
And you're on with, by the way, for listeners just tuning in, the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, Ben Smith. Now, David, let's see. Remind me, you're out of the council now, right?
I am. I'm in academia, and although I remember when Ben Smith was a young City Hall reporter and was an extraordinarily insightful and sophisticated reporter, and if I was smarter, I would have bought stock in him at that very point, because the talent was obvious. But my question is, as somebody who consumes a lot of journalism and I realize more than ever that investigative or kind of deep dive journalism is so essential. How do you think it's going to continue in an era where I also expect to read things for free? Have you guys, is BuzzFeed the solution, or are there many solutions?
Nice to hear from you, David. Thank you for the kind words. And I mean, it's something, of course, that we think about all the time. I mean, I think and hope there are a lot of solutions. I think, you see the New York Times and the Washington Post building really impressive subscription businesses, people paying for their journalism. That's an incredibly healthy sign. That also, though, means that if you are one of the, imagine if they get 1% of the American population, or say 2%, that's a great subscription business. That is 98% of people who can't read their publications. And I think from our perspective, our sort of mission is, and very much in our DNA, is serving kind of the open internet and serving anybody and everybody. And so we are, I think, would like to avoid going behind a paywall. The advertising business is historically a great business associated with journalism. It has its ups and downs, but we have a really strong advertising business, and we've also been, the media business is actually very complicated and boring, basically, but have been, and getting into a lot of other businesses lately as well, including television. I think, in terms of investigative journalism, we've certainly found over maybe just the last few years that just the sheer volume of stuff being thrown on the internet, to me, I think is actually starting to diminish, and the appetite for quality and the ability of the platforms to get you the quality news is going up. I mean, yesterday, a biggest story on our website was this incredible oral history of the congressional shooting last year. Really kind of deep, rich reporting, great writing.
The one on the baseball field where Steve Scalise got
you
so
almost
badly
had
wounded.
It was almost the biggest political assassination in American history. This incredibly near miss that kind of got memory hold in this news cycle today. But but it was pretty heartening to see that was the story that was being most widely distributed and shared. And so I actually think that in this kind of noisy, cluttered environment, people are increasingly looking for and increasingly able to find quality.
Another question from here in the green space. Hi there.
Hi, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how much chaos is there in Washington? I mean, from your sources, is this just crazy chaos like we're thinking it might be, or is it still kind of normal?
So like when those Department of Homeland Security color chart, it's like orange, I think. I think that this really is. Obama at some point said that he was running the most transparent administration in history. This is undoubtedly the most transparent administration in modern history. They leak constantly. Axios had a great piece yesterday about sort of interviewing leakers about why they leaked. I mean, I think what you read, what Maggie Haberman's reporting every day is basically it. Yeah, it's a entertainment figure running a sort of a reactive television presidency.
Before you go, I said I was going to get your article called "What Comes After the Social Media Empires," and relevant to the previous questioner about models in journalism and so forth. But in this article, you compared Facebook and some other social media giants to a mid-20th century European power, basically agonizing over the loss of its colonies around the world. That's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, you really liked that one, didn't you? I think basically what you see with Facebook and YouTube right now, in particular, and Twitter, is right. They took all this real estate. They took over all these areas of the culture, and now are sort of saying like, wait, it's really not worth what it costs us to hold on to certain of these territories. We're going to let I think yesterday we had a story on how the kind of weed YouTube community got kind of forced off the site. Advertisers don't want it. It's sort of too much trouble. People who make videos about guns, all sorts of distasteful political elements that they find politically distasteful. Essentially, news in general is getting pushed off Facebook to some degree. And so I think you're seeing them sort of give back elements of all this land they've taken. And that, in some ways, at the fringes, is leaving space for new social media platforms to emerge, new smaller group communications in a way that is right now, very much confined to the fringes. Is they're the gun tubers, sex workers who got tossed off the internet in this kind of recent crackdown on prostitution, are sort of have moved on to these Mastodon, which is a Twitter alternative. There's I think you're seeing people, the kind of weed community, which is, by the way, legal in a lot of the country now, move on to different social media platforms. Those are like classic fringe communities, but I think you are seeing a bit of splintering after 5 years of real consolidation.
And then where does that go? I mean, that could be good or bad, right? Either really dangerous stuff, like if they can really police fake news, which I'm not sure if they can really discern real from fake somewhere in Facebook headquarters. But, if the original utopian vision of the internet, especially the sharing internet as opposed to the searching internet, was that people would be passing around political content as well as personal content, and there would be more awareness of the world in general, and that's given way to this dystopian vision of the social media world. But I don't want information to stop flowing either that's issue-oriented.
Right. I mean, I think that Facebook in particular rose with this vision to connect the world, and they weren't thinking, well, we're also going to connect ISIS. I mean, they saw it as a sort of moral positive to connect people. I think what's become clear is, well, you connect different kinds of people. I think Facebook is very committed to trying to throw ISIS off there, and there are executives that members of Congress can yell at if they find ISIS postings. As you move toward encrypted and or decentralized social media platforms with maybe no executives and maybe no way to see into them. I mean, that's already true on, for instance, WhatsApp, where in India in particular, WhatsApp is the main platform for the spread of fake news, of what we call fake news. And it's encrypted. There's no, we can't look into other people's groups and say, and the government can't, and WhatsApp can't. So I think that we may look back at the 2016 election and say, wow, that was great. I wish it was like that.
Please thank Ben Smith, editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed.
Thank you.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the green space.